Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest Adam Smith Institute webinar. Thank you very much for registering and spending an hour of your Tuesday evening with us. My name is Daniel Pryor, and I'm head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute. And for any of you who might be joining for the first time and aren't familiar with us, we're a free market think tank based in London in the UK, and our goal is to try and change policy and public opinion through our research, media appearances, various events like this one, and broader education programs as well. But this evening's webinar is going to explore a fascinating issue that's beginning to get more media coverage lately, and that's how psychedelic drugs like psilocybin can help transform mental health treatment. This is also the subject of a recently released paper from the Adam Smith Institute alongside the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, which I can put a link to in this webinar chat very shortly, and that's titled Medicinal Use of Psilocybin, Reducing Restrictions on Research and Treatment. And we're very lucky to be joined by some truly expert speakers tonight who all in fact helped co-author that paper. Earlier this month, the Lancet published a study showing that young people and women's mental health had been hit particularly hard during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. But even before that, we had over 1 million adults in the UK who are struggling with treatment-resistant depression, with very slow progress in research since the development of the first SSRIs decades ago. Now, one of the most promising areas for inquiry at the moment is something called psilocybin, which is the active psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms. And the evidence from early stage clinical trials conducted recently suggests that psilocybin therapy, when it's administered properly, could be a safe and really effective treatment for things like PTSD or treatment-resistant depression. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where Home Office red tape is making it very difficult to conduct research into this molecule. And tonight we're going to be discussing how we can help kickstart that research into a substance that could, in theory, revolutionize mental health treatment, both in the UK and also around the world. Now, once we've heard from tonight's speakers, we're going to be going to you, the audience, with questions from your fine selves watching along. But for now, let's kick things off with our first speaker. And that's going to be Dr. James Rucker, who is a consultant psychiatrist and a senior clinical lecturer in mood disorders and psychopharmacology at King's College London. Now, interestingly, he was a clinician in the first pilot study of psilocybin into treatment-resistant depression led by Professor David Nutt, and he currently leads the Psychedelic Trials Group alongside Professor Alan Young. So he should be well placed to talk us through the medical potential of psilocybin, as well as the results of the trials that have been conducted so far. So if I can hand over to you, James, then please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be speaking to you. I've got 10 minutes, I think, to speak. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So like all good academics, I've got some slides which I'm going to use as a prompt, and like many good academics, they're slides that I have partly stolen from someone. I can't share my screen. Is that intentional?
That shouldn't be intentional, no. There should be an option.
It's all right, it's working now.
Okay.
So I hope you can all see that. So this is a photo I always show because this is the first ever bottle of psilocybin that I prescribed in a clinical trial back in 2018. This was a phase 1 trial where we're looking at the effects of psilocybin on cognitive and emotional functioning in healthy volunteers, 89 healthy volunteers. The results of this will be published later this year, I think. But I'm going to say a little bit about treatment-resistant depression, just to sort of give a sense of the scale of the problem that we're trying to address in part by developing psilocybin therapy. So I'm employed by King's College London. My salary is paid by the UK taxpayer, so thank you if you're one of them. That's via the National Institute for Health Research, or the NIHR. I'm a consultant in the NHS. I work at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. My grant funding there is mostly from NIHR, UK government, and charities such as the Wellcome but we also received grant funding from Compass Pathways, and they are the people who manufactured that bottle of medication there. And that's been a game changer when it comes to the development of psilocybin therapy. No one was doing that prior to Compass in 2016-17. I don't have any shareholdings in pharmaceutical companies, but I do. I am a shareholder in a medical cannabis clinic called Sapphire. So just so you know about what my interests and conflicts are here. Just a little bit about treatment-resistant depression itself. The problem with depression is it's startlingly common. Probably about 300 million people around the world suffering with depression at the moment. So about 5% of the population. And the problem is that depression tends to be very chronic. Quite a lot of people respond to established treatment, but a lot of people don't. And the people that I see are the people in the hatched orange part of the pie graph, and they have treatment-resistant depression, and that comprises about 10 to 30% of people with depression. So you do the maths, and you've got around 100 million people with very disabling illness that's affecting their ability to relate with others, relate to their world, to work, to be with fathers, mothers, daughters, and be socioeconomically active. So it's a big problem for governments as well as the people who are suffering, and a big problem for me in the clinics that I do in the NHS. And it's an increasing problem. Depression is anticipated to be the second leading cause of disease burden by the year 2030. Slightly depends on the way you measure these things, but the basic issue is depression is very disabling, whatever way you look at it. It's also associated intimately with suicide. There are 800,000 suicides through the world every year, about 6,000 in the UK. And a half of those, 50%, are associated with depression. So it's a big cause of mortality. Suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 55 and a very large killer of young people in general. So depression is a big problem, and it has real demonstrable impacts on society, individuals, and carers and families. So if you do have treatment-resistant depression, you're likely also to present with lots of other symptoms such as anxiety, panic disorder, social phobia, melancholia, which is sort of existential despair, and you're much more likely to be at suicide risk. So TRD is a big problem because it goes on and people don't respond well to currently available treatments. I have people in my clinics who have been through 10, 20, 30 different treatments for depression, psychotherapy, various other different treatments, and it's not working for them. They've been unwell for decades. And the impact on their lives is just astonishing. What we know about depression is that people who have histories of abuse tend to respond much less well to established treatments. So here's a study from 2016. And what you can see in the bar graphs are the number of people who respond to an antidepressant treatment. Response and remission are just two different terms. People who respond get about 50% better. People who remit get almost completely better. It doesn't really matter about that difference. The point is that people who have been subject to abuse in childhood are much, much less likely to respond to currently available treatment. And I see that all the time in clinics. So the question is, can we develop better treatments for people who have been traumatized in the past, particularly in childhood? Current treatments do not work very well for them. So this is the sort of classical treatment pathway for depression at the moment, medical treatment of depression. We start by giving people something like fluoxetine or Prozac, and if that doesn't work, then we switch to another drug. And if that doesn't work, then we classify people as being resistant to treatment. And as I say, about a third of people with depression become treatment resistant. And they may be particularly people who have suffered abuse in childhood or in their adult lives that they're struggling to process. And there are various treatments that we can try but in treatment-resistant depression, but often they are old and stigmatized. So lithium is used quite extensively, and electroconvulsive therapy. But there are generally not a lot of options for people with treatment-resistant depression. There are a lot of Me Too drugs that you can try, which will often not work. Or there are old stigmatized treatments that often patients don't find acceptable. So prior to 1970, psilocybin and LSD were both prescribed in this population, in the treatment-resistant population, and they were found to be helpful. We've published a systematic review of the evidence prior to 1970. It's not great evidence, but nonetheless, trials were done prior to 1970, showing that within the subset of people who were resistant to treatment with classical treatment, in combination with psychotherapy, LSD and psilocybin were very helpful in treating those people with treatment-resistant forms of depression, anxiety, and also things like alcoholism and addiction to other substances. Perhaps counterintuitive, since LSD and psilocybin are drugs themselves, but they seem to have a curious anti-addictive property. And the way they seem to do this is by challenging and dissolving people's habitual ways of behaving and thinking about the world. But the problem that happened was they became caught up in, they diffused into recreational use, became caught up in a sort of moral panic around drug use, and they were placed in Schedule 1 of the UN, single UN Convention on Narcotic Substances. And that designated them as having no medical use, even though they were being medically used. So it was largely a political decision. It didn't really follow the scientific advice of the time. And countries who were members of the UN around the world mimicked these schedules. So in the UK, we have the Misuse of Drugs Act and its associated regulations, and psilocybin and LSD are both in Schedule 1. And that means that's a problem for me as a researcher. It means that I cannot prescribe the drug, and no doctor can prescribe the drug without a special Home Office license. In practice, it's very difficult to get those licenses. Indeed, until about 10 years ago, doctors were not given those licenses. And it also imposes huge amounts of bureaucracy and safe custody requirements onto the drugs themselves that makes them very practically difficult to use in research. Indeed, no one was producing psilocybin until Compass did in 2016 because of the burdens and the costs associated with manufacturing a Schedule 1 drug. But things have moved on. We now have psilocybin being manufactured, albeit under Schedule 1 restrictions. And grant funders and pharma funders are becoming interested in the development of psilocybin assisted therapy in treatment-resistant conditions like depression. So we're sort of picking up the baton of history from 1970 now in 2020. And this has allowed me to form a small team at King's. We undertake clinical trials with psilocybin. They are very slow, very bureaucratic, very expensive, partly because of Schedule 1 restrictions, but we are doing it. It's a bit like wading through treacle, but we are doing it. This is some of the team. And this is the dosing room, which I thought I'd show you. This is within King's College Hospital. This is where we give people our psilocybin. You see it's comfortable, almost sort of living room-like, but with trappings of medicine as well. It's designed to sort of strike a balance between the safety of medical oversight and also not feeling too clinical for the participants in the trials. These are the trials that we are undertaking in my group at the moment. So you can see the line goes along from inception to authorization to completion and publication. That process generally takes around 4 to 5 years for each trial. So we, as I mentioned, completed a phase 1 trial with Compass in healthy volunteers. 89 participants completed that trial. And in that trial, we show that psilocybin has no deleterious effects on cognition and emotional processing in healthy volunteers. We previously completed a pilot trial in treatment-resistant depression at Imperial that was led by Robin Carhart-Harris and David Nutt, and I was a clinician on that. That was an open-label pilot study, though. It wasn't a randomized controlled trial. You need randomized controlled trials in order to develop the drug through to market. So that's what we're doing now. That is PTRD, again funded by Compass Pathways. That's a multi-site phase 2B trial with psilocybin in about 200 patients with treatment-resistant depression. That's a gold standard clinical trial. And that should lead on, if the data is good, to a phase 3 trial. Phase 3 trials are even larger. They're multinational, multi-site, many hundreds of patients, very, very expensive to conduct, and particularly difficult under Schedule 1 legislation. Probably not impossible, but almost impossible. And that's the problem. That's why we had to write this report, to encourage the Home Office to think about the scheduling of psilocybin again. Psilocybin is currently more legally restricted than medical heroin, but medical heroin is much more dangerous. In fact, psilocybin is from a physiological point of view, really very innocuous. It's a pretty safe drug, particularly when given under medically controlled circumstances. When I sign a prescription for psilocybin, I do not worry about it the same way that I worry with a prescription for some of the antipsychotic drugs that we routinely give people to take away and take at home. So that just gives you a feel for the mismatch between my clinical experience of how dangerous this drug is and the government's view of how dangerous this drug is. The scientific evidence does not back up Schedule 1 status. There are a variety of other trials that are sort of in the inception, funding, authorization stage. You can see some of these. They're focused on anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder. We've got ideas for other trials in the pipeline, but the problem, as always, is money, particularly in light of the costs incurred by Schedule 1. We're also undertaking the MDMA for PTSD trial. This is slightly separate, but a charity in the US has been developing MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD and is bringing that over to Europe, and we're helping them with that. MDMA, also a Schedule 1 drug, so again, difficult because of the costs and regulatory hurdles and bureaucracy that is inherent in that. So this is where we are with psilocybin. This is the drug development process. You go from phase 1 through phase 2 through to phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials allow you to make an application for a marketing license. And if you get that marketing license, then usually that would mean that a Schedule 1 drug is rescheduled to Schedule 2. The problem that we have is going from phase 2 to phase 3 in the face of Schedule 1 restrictions. As I say, it's not impossible, but it is incredibly difficult. It is needlessly difficult, given that the drug is not particularly dangerous. So, clinical trials do have the power to challenge the legal status of psychedelics and challenge the stigmas around them. But by God, is it made difficult by Schedule 1 legislation, and this is the reason for writing our report. So, these are the barriers to licensing psilocybin. Pretty simple in what I've already said already. Schedule 1 bureaucracy and the cost of the trials. Clinical trials generally cost, phase 3 trials, I was talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Indeed, the average cost for getting a drug through to market, this is a JAMA article appeared earlier this year, is nearly $1 billion. much of that is the regulation and bureaucracy surrounding clinical trials. So this is just to finish up. How do we develop psilocybin, psychedelics, in a way that governments and wider society can engage with? I said this before at the other drug science event. I think that health-related argument and clinical trials is a way that we can engage with governments and societies in a way that they can understand. I think those clinical trials need to focus on areas where there is unmet clinical needs, so not simple depression where we already have treatments that work, but the treatment-resistant depression, I think it's a very reasonable area to focus on, particularly given that there is evidence from past history that these drugs in the context of psychotherapy do work. We do need to pay heed to the history of these drugs, though. They come from a distinct culture, and we know that the set and the setting of the psilocybin experience is critical in determining their outcome. We need to pay due respect to their power to inculcate change and make sure that we don't cut corners and reduce quality in the treatments that we're delivering. And I think we need to be realistic. Psychedelics are not a replacement for anything. They're an addition to established treatments. And I think if we keep those 4 tenets in mind, then we have a real possibility of challenging Schedule 1 status of psilocybin. So I'm going to stop there. I know there are other speakers, and we'll take questions, I think, at the end. Is that right, Daniel?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview, James. Just a quick question from me before we move on to our next speaker, and a reminder to our audience that you can submit your own questions via Zoom. I imagine some people watching will be wondering how psilocybin therapy actually works in practice, things like the practicalities of how long people are in treatment, how do people respond, and what sort of psychological support they get. What does this actually look like in the clinic?
Well, so it's delivered as a package with a psychological therapist who follows you through your journey. So they get to know you, they get to know your specific difficulties, why you might be feeling the way you're feeling, what you're hoping to change. And they help to prepare you for the psilocybin experience, and they are then with you on the day when you come in for your psilocybin experience to the hospital. And the style of therapy is quite different really to what we classically think of as psychotherapy. So we will, for example, hold your hand, you know, if you're really struggling and that's something that you need. We call it interpersonal grounding. And there's a sense of trying to achieve a reconnection with the self, with feeling, with trauma, with whatever difficulty it is that's driving your depression through the psilocybin experience and the setting that it's delivered within. And then after that, there are a series of psychological therapy sessions to integrate what you've experienced and found out about yourself, and make a plan really about how you're going to take that into your life. How are you going to change things to help yourself? So it's a process of self-discovery really, often a difficult journey in the context of ongoing depression, but within that safe and supportive setting, we hope a therapeutic one for the patient.
Oh, thank you, James. Now it's time to move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Joanna Neill. And she is the Professor of Psychopharmacology at the University of Manchester. She's been conducting research in psychopharmacology for almost 30 years, and specifically in the area of developing preclinical models of psychiatric disorders. And she's a prolific author. She's she's authored over 70 peer-reviewed publications in top scientific journals, but of course her most prestigious publication is undoubtedly this most recent paper with the Adam Smith Institute and the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. Joanna is going to help us dive into some of the barriers to psilocybin research that James has mentioned, those Schedule 1 barriers, and what problems they end up creating for scientists in the UK. Joanna.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel, for a lovely introduction. And you're probably right. This is probably the most important publication I've authored so far, and a real privilege to do so. And of course, academics research is all about impact, and this report should create a lot of impact, I hope. And thank you very much to James. What a fantastic run through of an enormous amount of work, and brave to be doing this work. As he explained, it's almost impossible because of Schedule 1 restrictions and stigma. Extremely difficult work to do, but as you've heard, this work is so essential for patients, for enabling patients to get well. So I'm chair of Drug Science's Medical Psychedelics Working Group, and in fact all three speakers this evening are on that working group, and a number of world experts. It's a fantastic group. As I hope you all know, Drug Science is the UK's independent organisation providing evidence-based information about drugs for people, so education, research. And one of the key goals of this particular working group is enabling patients to access psychedelic medicine when it becomes available as a medicine. And with people like James working so hard on this, we really hope that that will not be too long. So one of Drug Science's success stories is enabling patients to access medical cannabis. And in fact, today is the official launch of Project 2021. I hope you all are aware of that. So there will, of course, be difficulties even once this is approved by the regulatory authorities as a medicine, but a much needed medicine, as we've heard. And of course, research is absolutely central to this, as James has told you, the clinical trials, the large scale clinical trials, but also the basic science. And we really need to understand the mechanisms by which psychedelics produce their effects. This is extremely important. And this is earlier stage research done by people like me, so preclinical researchers. Some of this work is done. For example, there's some evidence that psychedelics have very powerful anti-inflammatory properties, and a number of disorders are characterized by inflammation, and some psychiatric disorders, subset of patients, by neuroinflammation. There's not an awful lot known about that, so this is certainly something that I would like to explore. Synaptogenesis, you know, the creation of new synapses, circuitry changes, and what about other effects on other parts of the body? What about the microbiome? So these are all aspects that research will enable. So for me, I'm an academic researcher. I'm based at the University of Manchester, but I've been working in drug discovery for psychiatric illness for all my career, which is over 30 years. I've worked in industry, the pharmaceutical industry. I've worked in research institutions here and abroad, and I've worked in academia. My research is early stage effectiveness in animal models to determine whether a drug will progress forward into clinical stage research. So I'm testing molecules that have never been tested in man before. Big Pharma pulled out of psychiatry research over 10 years ago. And I would say we've hit a brick wall in psychiatry research. There are some fantastic projects I've worked on, some great molecules, great targets in the brain that we're targeting. But we are not enabling patients to access the medicines they so desperately need quickly enough. And as James told you, for these very hard to treat conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, refractory depression, addictions, anorexia, very difficult to be a psychiatrist trying to treat these conditions. So psilocybin is the molecule I should have been working on all along. It has such fantastic healing potential for patients and fascinating pharmacology and enormous therapeutic potential. So rescheduling, why is it so important, and why are the barriers there for Schedule 1, molecules that are in Schedule 1? So all psychedelics are in Schedule 1, and some cannabis products are still sitting in Schedule 1. A lot of the experts have written articles about this. James Rucker has written a very good article. David Nichols, one of the godfathers of psychedelic research in the States, and the BAP, the British Association for Psychopharmacology, the UK's leading organisation, for psychopharmacology, psychiatry. We have written a report on this, and we sent a questionnaire to our members. So what I have done at Manchester is to conduct a qualitative study, interviewing researchers up and down the country about their experiences with Schedule 1 research and the barriers to research. And what we have encountered is a great deal of frustration, a lot of confusion, and most worryingly, I think, is many laboratories will not do this work because of the scheduling restrictions. Now, a couple of things I need to make clear. The Home Office states that anyone can do this research. All you need to do is apply for controlled drugs license. That is true, but it's only partly true. And I would like to explain to you in a little bit of detail why it is so difficult to acquire one of these licenses. And even once you have a license, why this research is difficult. The other thing I'd really like you to understand is that any drug that sits in Schedule 2 and lots of other chemicals, we don't have any restrictions, or we don't need a special license, I should say, to research Schedule 2 drugs. So heroin, cocaine, amphetamine. For my animal model, I use phencyclidine, and that is a close relative of ketamine. It sits in Schedule 2. I have never had any problems with it. So as scientists, we work, and clinicians, we work in laboratories, in pharmacies. We follow standard operating procedures, health and safety. We know all about storing drugs and chemicals safely. And I am testing routinely drugs that have never been tested in man. So for us, it's very frustrating, and we find it hard to understand why we have all these extra controls in place for a Schedule 1 drug. That actually doesn't make any sense. And as James told you, the definition of a Schedule 1 drug is that it has no therapeutic value. And we've known in history, and I really like James's phrase that he's taking up the baton of research now. His work, David Nutt's, Robin Carhart-Harris, I mean, the UK is leading research in this field, tells us that this is not correct anymore, that psychedelics do have very important medical value. So let me just tell you a little bit, I'm aware of time, but a little bit about the difficulties. So I would say we have 4 categories. We have cost, stigma, bureaucracy, and delay. So for me, it costs about £3,300 to get a controlled drugs license. And that is just for the license. So as I said, lots of extra checks and balances. You have to have a locked and alarmed cabinet. Whoever holds the license has to have a DBS security check. You have to engage trained personnel to dispose of the drug. None of this applies to Schedule 2 drugs or any of those other first not tested in man yet molecules that I'm testing routinely. So that's about £4,000 for me. James, for a clinical trial, it's significantly more expensive. He, for our survey, explained that he needs 6 separate controlled drugs licenses. So that's a license at every step of the way, from manufacture to the pharmacy to dispensing to putting the drug in a capsule to blinding the study. That's over £20,000 out of his research budget, which is taxpayers' money, before he can even get the drug into a patient. There's costs for renewing the license and a Home Office inspection. You have to pay for that as a researcher if that is required in the meantime. So the cost, and I learned talking to a lot of colleagues that this is too much money, the £3,000, universities don't pay for this. They don't have that sort of research money. Research is very, very expensive, folks. And that's a lot of money out of your research budget. So many people will not do this research. The delays are very long. So our research showed that it takes between 6 months and a year to get the Home Office license. It took me a year, 6 months seemed to be standard. The form itself is very long and difficult. We had a very interesting interview with a pharmacist about how awful it is to fill in the form. It took her about a week. I would say the restrictions caused by the schedule license hinder research and innovation in research, and collaboration is at the forefront of successful research and innovation, working with colleagues, working with people in different teams to you. And that's disabled by having a Schedule 1 license, because every building requires its own Schedule 1 license. I had a colleague working on a different species from me in a different building at Manchester, wanted to work with some cannabinoids, needed his own controlled drugs license, didn't have the money to do it, didn't do that research. So it's very disabling. Any transport issues, that's another issue with having a Schedule 1 license. And actually for PCP, I worked with colleagues abroad, and the Home Office gave us permission for them to send me, to manufacture it in their labs, send me PCP by courier in 2 weeks. So a Schedule 2 drug, folks, there are no restrictions. We are trusted with Schedule 2 drugs. And the stigma makes it very difficult as well. And I think that's one of the big problems with psychedelic research, is this historical stigma that seems to surround them for no good reason that I can see. These drugs, as James explained, are certainly safe. They are certainly not dangerous drugs. So that is very difficult. The ethics committees and the bureaucracy in the university, or the heads of the teams, are very nervous about handling and working with a Schedule 1 drug, even for animal research. I've had quite a lot of difficulties with the ethics committees. And we don't have any of that for Schedule 2 drugs. People are much more comfortable with this. So really that's me done, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to James and Daniel. Just to reiterate how difficult it is to do this research on psychedelics that's so badly needed. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Joanna. Just some quick questions from me before we move on to our final speaker. What is it that the Home Office say in attempting to justify the current Schedule 1 restrictions? Are they worried that it's going to be diverted into the recreational street market, or is it just something they don't really respond to?
I don't really understand, actually. I haven't personally had that dialogue. I get the impression there's a serious worry about it being diverted. And that I cannot, I don't think that's ever happened. Why would an academic divert anything anywhere? We wouldn't know what to do to start with. That doesn't make any sense. So what I sort of got from the research that we did was that people are incredibly frustrated with this, but there's a lot of confusion. There are molecules in Schedule 1 that people didn't realize were there. 5-HT2A receptor agonists, sorry for the lingo people. And that's quite worrying.
Yeah, I can imagine. The other thing that popped out at me, you said that Big Pharma had kind of effectively pulled out of psychiatry research. Why is that? What's the story there?
Well, there were 2 very spectacular failures in phase 3. And I think there were 2 of the largest pharmaceutical companies. And I think that scared quite a lot of people. But it just seemed to kind of be a collective, because we were working with many of those companies at the time, and they kind of pulled out one after the other, and focused probably more on neurology, more on pain. The feeling was that it was far too expensive and far too risky because they'd had so many failures. So the sort of standard randomized controlled trial seems, is very, very difficult. There have been some spectacular failures, very, very sad, and very sad for patients. But now we have a reinvigoration with this psychedelic medicine, and that's very, very exciting and very hopeful for patients. I mean, I should say that lots of small biotechs took up that baton, and there's a lot of fabulous talent in the UK with smaller companies working on drug discovery for psychiatry, but most of Big Pharma have headed away.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. That's really interesting. I wasn't aware that was the situation in terms of research. But moving on to our final speaker this evening, before we go to Q&A, we've got Dave King, who is the Director of Research at the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, or the CDPRG, as they're sometimes called. He's previously worked as a researcher at the Beckley Foundation, as well as the National University of Singapore's Immunology Department. He's the co-editor of 4 books and has published a number of book chapters, scientific papers, open letters, and other pieces himself. He's also the founder of Breaking Convention, which is Europe's largest academic conference on psychedelic drug research. And he's going to be running us through and discussing what the political roadmap to reform in this area looks like, as well as what kind of support it already has at this stage. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Good evening, everybody. You've heard two great talks there from James and Joe about the importance and the clinical potential of psilocybin research, the urgent need for innovative therapies in mental health to broaden the range of treatment options available for doctors and patients, particularly where other antidepressants haven't worked. And we've also heard about how difficult it is to do with research at the moment into psychedelic drugs because they're in Schedule 1. So I hope that you'll agree with us all that this situation at the moment is an ethical, economic and humanistic tragedy in need of urgent reform. So I'll be helping explain what actually needs to happen to reschedule psilocybin. And I've just learned that many of tonight's audience may actually work in Westminster. So please forgive me if I tell you things that you all already know. It's been 71 years now since the first research publication reported antidepressant effects after giving patients a psychedelic drug, and almost 50 years since the Misuse of Drugs Act was passed. So at first glance, it might seem that the reason that it's still so difficult to study these drugs today in 2020 is that the regulations must be staggeringly difficult or complex to change. But the reality is that those regulations could be changed very, very easily in a matter of weeks with relatively little effort if the Home Office ministers were so inclined. And there really is no defensible reason why that shouldn't happen. So the process, as many of you may already know, goes like this. So by law, the Home Secretary first has to ask the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs for their advice, who will carefully look at all the evidence and make a judgment about whether or not rescheduling is the right thing to do. And when they say yes, it should be rescheduled, as we strongly expect that they will, because that's what the evidence supports. Then the next step is for the Home Office to issue a short bit of legislation called a statutory instrument, only a few pages long, which gets passed under something called the negative parliamentary procedure. And that means that it becomes law on the day that the minister signs it, and it automatically stays law unless the House of Parliament or the House of Lords raise and agree a motion to reject it within 40 days, which would be quite unlikely, I think, in this case. So a rescheduling instrument doesn't need to be debated in Parliament. It doesn't need to go through months of revisions and votes. It's simply passed into law just like that, and psilocybin is out of Schedule 1. And all it takes is for the Home Office to make that decision. But that is where this seemingly simple process suddenly grinds to a halt, right at the beginning. In the push for drug policy reform, speaking much more generally now, it's often not enough to have compelling evidence. It's not enough to have a strong argument. It's not enough to have the advice of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. It all comes down to the whim of whatever minister is in charge. A minister who may have received little or no training when they take the job, who requires no expertise in the area that they become responsible for, and for complex reasons, policy to do with controlled drugs and any issue to do with controlled drugs is so often perceived as being a moral issue, much more than it's perceived as being a health issue. The 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which provided the international framework for how we govern activities govern people in relation to drugs around the world, described the misuse of drugs as an evil. So it's always been couched in these moral terms, and psychedelic drugs in particular are hugely stigmatized. Morality is not so much guided by logic and data as it is by intuition and instinct. We don't rationally determine that we're morally opposed to something, we feel it. And for those who feel moral anxiety rise when the issue of drug reform comes up, that data is usually not enough to change their minds. According to moral foundation theory, the political left prioritize the moral foundations of care, fairness, and liberty. Social conservatives also value care, fairness, and liberty, but they also place equal priority on the foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. That moral foundation of sanctity or purity relates to an abhorrence for disgusting or polluting things, which explains part of the moral aversion to controlled drugs, because they're so often portrayed as damaging, intoxicating, or otherwise perverting to human faculties and social order. So in other words, they're perceived as being impure and subversive, relating to the moral foundations of sanctity and authority. And we see this in our polling. Our polling has shown that conservative voters are more likely to describe drug use across the board as being fundamentally a moral or a criminal issue, whereas Labour and Lib Dem voters are much more likely to conceptualise drug use as a health issue, which reflects the liberal moral compass that prioritises care and the protection from harm above most other foundations. And these ideological differences in moral priorities are partly why it's been so difficult to get traction on any substantial form of drug policy reform in the UK, which is a very conservative country. If the next election is 3 years away, then Tony Blair will have been the only non-conservative Prime Minister to have been elected by the British people in more than 40 years. So this British conservatism is partly why our drug classification and scheduling laws are still not directly linked to the scientific evidence on the relative harms and benefits of drugs 50 years on. And it's not to do with conservatives not liking or not understanding evidence, that would be absurd. It's to do with deep moral concerns in our society with quite complex historical origins. Labour have been very conservative on this issue too. Now, when we look specifically at rescheduling psilocybin, we sidestep some of the moral challenges which are encountered in other areas of drug policy. We're talking about a policy change that would only affect legitimate scientific and medical research. So that avoids the concerns about the subversion of authority that can be associated with the issue of non-medicinal drug use. And because psilocybin is being used medicinally in this context, it doesn't represent a movement away from the purity of an unintoxicated mind, but instead toward the purity of health. Rescheduling wouldn't send the wrong message to society. It would send the message that government supports the mental health sector. Our recent report that's been mentioned a few times tonight already shows that the model of rescheduling that we propose wouldn't increase the risk of diversion or inappropriate prescribing, or indeed any form of drug-related crime. So in the ongoing challenge to bring about evidence-based drugs policy, rescheduling psilocybin may be a relatively easy win. But the reason that I've said everything that I have in the last couple of minutes is that the significance of the stigma attached to these drugs is still substantial. Stigma shouldn't have anything to do with it, but it does. And somehow we have to persuade the ministers that rescheduling psilocybin is something worth doing. So in collaboration with the ASI and a whole series of other stakeholders, including drug science. The CDPRG has been running a campaign for the best part of a year now. So we've met and made the case to the Home Office Drugs Minister and the heads of the civil servant drug teams. We worked with the ASI to release the recent policy paper. We've commissioned an economic analysis, which will be due out in a couple of months. And now it's time to raise the pressure on the Home Office to get on with doing the right thing for UK patients and the life sciences sector. And that's where we need you guys. We need your support. If you don't happen to work in Parliament yourself, we encourage you to sign, send and subscribe. That means signing a new parliamentary petition. That'll be out in the next few days. Sending a letter to your MP to ask them what they'll be doing about it, and subscribing to our mailing list to stay in the loop and stay involved. And if you're not exactly sure what to say to your MP, we've written a template letter. You can find that and more details at cdprg.co.uk/psilocybin. I'll put that in the chat because CDPRG isn't as catchy as we'd like it to be, and no one can spell psilocybin, so you don't have to remember. And if any of you happen to work in Parliament or connected directly to that world, then please get involved. Write to the Home Office, read the report, share it with your peers, challenge the stigma when you see it. Rescheduling is really a tiny, low-risk legislative change which will have a massive impact. And at the end of the day, this is about science and it's about patients, pure and simple. So there's no good reason not to do it.
Well, thank you very much there, Dave, for the call to action there as well. It's time now to move on to some of your questions sent in this evening. Unfortunately, we're running a little behind, so we won't get quite as long as we'd hope. But this first one is asking, what sort of support does reform have among groups like veterans or former police officers and others who might be at greater risk of things like PTSD? Joanna, I know you're perhaps familiar with someone who might be in one of these groups. This could be a question for you, maybe.
Absolutely. So we're working closely with Heroic Hearts, which is one of the veteran charities. Of course, James is doing trial coming up, hopefully on PTSD. This is a very, very important issue. And another research project that I'm working on is interviewing combat veterans about their experiences with psilocybin. Now, these are very deep interviews, and we have conducted 7 so far, and there is enormous therapeutic potential. And so, you know, you're talking about combat veterans, and Crispin Blunt says this so beautifully, doesn't he, that they signed a blank check on their lives for this country. And they cannot, and so these are chaps we've talked to that are not responding, as James said, to any other available medication, because of course there are NHS veteran, a lot of good NHS veteran work going on. But they had to leave this country to access the medicine that they needed so badly. In particular, I'm reminded of a veteran that I spoke to who decided to take himself to Holland, sit in a hotel room with his girlfriend, 2 doses of psilocybin. You know, this is not a trivial treatment at all. And this is, you know, you've heard James, you would sit, you would have quite a lot of therapy before the psychedelic medical supervision session, and then a lot of integration afterwards. This chap had none of that. But he came out of that session well, and that was over 18 months ago, and he is still well. But I think that's absolutely shameful, but that these people cannot access the medicine that they need in this country, on the NHS. So he had to pay for himself, or these guys are paying to go to on retreats to Peru or these places. It's a terrible, terrible situation.
Yeah, and just following on from that, we've got another question here on other countries and whether there's been any progress on reform in this area. How, for example, how does the UK compare to, say, the United States or Europe and elsewhere? Are there places that are taking a slightly different attitude towards this at the moment?
I mean, absolutely. I'll just start. I'm sure that these two chaps know more than I do. But Oregon, they're having a vote, aren't they? They will be the first state to decriminalize psychedelics. They'll correct me if I'm wrong, hopefully. Oakland and Denver already have decriminalized psychedelics. I guess the other two know of other countries or states, perhaps.
Jim, do you want to go?
No, you go. Go best.
So the only thing I'd add to that is that in Canada, what we're beginning to see is something very similar to how cannabis reform happened there, i.e. through patient-driven legal cases, arguing for the right to access treatments that weren't available to them. And there are cases of that nature underway, and certainly with cannabis, that's very instrumental in changing the way in which patients could get hold of these things. But as far as I'm aware, there's no country that has, well, lots of different countries have different ways of splitting how drugs are controlled for authorized use and how drugs are, what criminal penalties are associated with possession and supply and so forth without licenses. In the UK, we have two separate bits. So we have we have the Misuse of Drugs Act, and then a whole separate set of regulations that give these different schedules which describe how they can be used professionally. And as far as I'm aware, there are no other countries that have effectively rescheduled psilocybin, and it still hasn't happened at the UN level. So the great benefit of that is that if we do it and we do it quickly, then this hugely rapidly developing area of biomedical research suddenly sweeps into the UK, and we seal our position as global leaders in this area of innovation.
Kind of following on from what Joanna mentioned, the chap who went and self-medicated abroad, maybe one for you, James, here. What would you say to people who are already self-medicating with psychedelics, other than, of course, the fact that they are committing a crime? What sort of advantages does psilocybin therapy in a clinic have? And since that is unavailable, are there potentially harm reduction resources out there?
Well, different things suit different people. So there are some people who would never consider taking psychedelics in a medical clinic. They would consider it anathema to the whole principle of the thing. And for them, they will seek out what they will. But and all I would say is get educated, know what you're doing, do your homework, and make sure you're safe. Because these drugs are not panaceas. They are hard work, and that represents the hard route of recovery for mental ill health. It is rarely easy, and it is often very difficult and emotionally challenging. You need the right support for that. So that brings me on to medical support and psychotherapy support. And for some people, that's how they would consider doing a psychedelic drug, is if it is contained within the structure of a medical clinic with sort of slightly more traditional, to me, psychotherapeutic support. So it depends on your set, depends on your mindset and what you bring to it. So that's what I'd say to that.
Well, useful advice there. And I'm afraid that's going to be where we're going to have to end it tonight. I'm sure there are several questions that perhaps we can follow up with individually afterwards. But thank you all so very much for joining us tonight for this webinar. I think it's been a really thorough and interesting explanation of the current state of where we're at with psychedelics research and how we can end up reforming mental health treatment to improve the lives of many, many people in the UK and around the world. But thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be announcing our next Adam Smith Institute webinar shortly. Goodbye for now.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.